Fantastic.
And if you all can remind me which names to look for to add anyone to panelists, that'd be great.
Jerry Vattamala and Jorge Vasquez.
Excellent.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We were just dealing with some technical issues on the back end because such is the way of Zoom life. We'll be starting shortly. We're just letting people trickle in. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mita Anand, Census 2020 Senior Fellow at the New York Immigration Coalition, and in that role serve as facilitator and convener of New York Counts 2020. Just a reminder to everyone, this event is being recorded, and we're also streaming live on Facebook, which was actually our delay in getting started. Please, we'll be sending in the chat box the Facebook link. Feel free to send it to one and all to make sure they can watch our exciting panel today. I am just here to give a brief introduction. This is day 3 of our Rebuilding New York conference, Census as Foundation. And on day 3, we thought it was important to discuss redistricting because all of the census work feeds into the very important work of redistricting. So when we're talking about what our representation looks like, it's the numbers from the census that go into the redistricting work that get us to that point of determining what our boundaries are going to look like, which then determines who represents us. So with that, I'm turning it over to our resident expert, my colleague, Jeff Wice. I've been working alongside him for a year now and enjoyed it thoroughly. He is a senior advisor at New York Counts 2020 and an adjunct professor and senior fellow. Hey, Jeff, we're both senior fellows. Look at that. That's so exciting. And a senior fellow at New York Law School. So Jeff will take it away and I'll speak to everyone later.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you to discuss redistricting, something that everyone hears about, might talk about, but wants to find out what it is all about. So before we get started with the program, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez from the New York State Assembly. He represents a district in East Harlem and the Upper East Side in Manhattan, and is the co-chair of the New York State Legislature's LATFOR, the Legislative Advisory Task Force on Reapportionment and Demographic Research, and he is the lead member of the Assembly to take on redistricting as we approach 2021 and 2022. So Assemblyman, I give the floor to you. You need to be unmuted.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks,
Okay.
Mita. I appreciate that. This comes on the heel on a really terrific panel yesterday talking about redistricting and reapportionment and the Independent Redistricting Commission, which I think we're going to dig into a little bit more in terms of its role in the redistricting process. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention what you guys have probably been talking over the last 2 days, which is the importance of the census and how do we mobilize and really get our numbers to where they should be. I know we've touched on how New York is under the national average. I think we're hovering around 58% when the rest of the nation's at 62, but we know that we have other parts of the city that are well below that. and much further below in the spectrum. East Harlem also has some significant hard to count areas. And we know how important this is because we can't talk about the end product unless we talk about the inputs that are coming in. And really, if we are undercounting and don't have the level of representation on the numbers going in, we stand to not just lose representation, but also to misrepresent and potentially misjudge like communities when we get to the redistricting and the drawing process. We are a country that is built upon this principle of one person, one vote. But if we have people who are not counted, their voices are not heard, those numbers are not represented in the lines that we draw, and ultimately are not represented in the way funding is allocated. So when we talk about all of the efforts around Census 2020, that will eventually feed into the redistricting process, it's important just to continue to hammer home, even through the pandemic and the challenges that we are all facing in terms of how to count people, that we do it either through the methods that we currently have, telephone, internet, before we get to the issue of enumerators and knocking on doors. So along those lines, as the representative in the legislature, we have been responsible for allocating funding. So I think we are currently up to about $30 million of appropriations for census counts. And it's important to mention that until we get that money out the door into the hands of groups that can, help us, like NIMIC and LatinoJustice and Hispanic Federation and all their folks who are representing underserved, communities, we stand a very high probability of being undercounted and underrepresented. So that money, I'm speaking to the choir, but for those viewers who are not aware of what the state has put in place, we are and have put money towards that effort, but we have to put it out and actually get the work done to be able to have those numbers that we need for this entire process. So shifting gears on that, so census, it's important. We have money towards it. The city put money towards it as well. I think they put another $40 million because it is that important, because that will, that small investment comes out to hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of decisions made on the federal government level. And our share gets determined sometimes strictly by the number of population we have. And I like to kind of cite an example, with the COVID funding, when folks were upset that someplace like Alaska, gets $1 million per COVID instance, that is driven by the number of residents that they had, not necessarily by the number of COVID, instances they had. It was strictly determined, numerically based on the number of population they had, what their share of the funding would be. And while we say it's unfair, that's where the census numbers matter. So we'll transition from census into redistricting. Now, this is actually the first time that we are utilizing an independent redistricting commission. We passed constitutional amendments that would, in our view, make the process less political. That was of course, our intent, to have more participation, bipartisan, a bipartisan commission that gets appointed, and a number of those representatives can't be affiliated with any party in an attempt to try and create a more a less politicized process. Let's just leave it at that. Now, I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussion about how political or non-political that is in reality. But I think ultimately it's the system that we have. It's the system that the voters, voted on, and the one that we are ultimately going to have to try to figure out how to work through in order to be able to provide, the outputs that we need, for redistricting, which would potentially take place with new lines in January of 2022. So, with that, I will leave the broad discussion about the structure of that to Jeff, and for folks who missed out on some of the great comments that were made on the existing structure and ways to improve it, I just refer you to the Assembly and Senate websites to catch the rebroadcast of yesterday's hearing, and a number of the folks who are participating here participated in that event as well. I think we got some really, really good ideas, but I think, what I think is going to come out of this discussion is that there's no one right answer. And the reason why this independent redistricting commission was formed and why we expect a really high level of public engagement is because there is no one master plan. After we get the census data, there are a number of different ways that districts can be created that empower communities and that allow for, let's call it majority minority communities to be best represented. And that requires the voice of community residents to make sure that we are not inadvertently, breaking up like communities, or, just to point out when there is issues of gerrymandering that are not taking into consideration either town lines, district lines, community lines, like communities. And that's something that I think, we need all eyes on and participating in. And, I like hearing, I've participated in a number of these discussions, but I love hearing from other states when they're able to say that they actually moved ahead with a public submitted plan because it was that good, So I think, when we get to that point, should we get to that point, I think all the discourse matters. Certainly the experts on this panel, the experts on the commission, as well as the public participating, to get the best result is what was intended in an independent redistricting commission process. And, I think, as a legislature, it will come to us for approval. But I think it's most important that, that the hearings happen and that everyone's voices are heard throughout this process, because I think we have seen historically, when gerrymandering occurs and there are communities that are disenfranchised in the state of New York, and hopefully is something that we get to remedy in 2022. So with that, I just want to say thank you for having me. And, on behalf of Speaker Hasty and the work that I do on LAT4, I just want to say thank you. And I look forward to working with everybody here, over the next 2 years to get to what we hope is a fairer and well-represented state where hopefully we don't lose any federal representation. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Assemblyman Rodriguez, for your welcoming remarks and your view of the redistricting to come and what the Assembly's goals and mission involves. I am going to spend the next few minutes just giving you all a broad view of the redistricting process, what it's about, how it works, and then I'm going to share the screen with Jennifer Wilson from the New York State League of Women Voters. The League was an essential part of the 2014 Commission creating amendment process, and she's been very much involved with educational outreach efforts on the Commission as it ramps up, as it's being created, and some comments on what it still needs to do. She'll be followed by Jerry Vattamala, who's the Counsel to the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund and my law school. And Jerry will talk about communities of interest in redistricting and the work that his organization does. And he'll be followed by LatinoJustice's counsel, Jorge Vasquez, who will talk about the interests in the Latino community and the process in general. We were to have been joined by Lurie Daniel Favors from the Center for Law and Justice at Medgar College, but a last-minute family situation prevented her from joining. For those of you who participated in New York Counts 2020's earlier sessions this week, you should have had a chance to see her. I think it was yesterday, the day before, and a dynamic speaker who we will try to make do without her today. I'm going to start briefly with a PowerPoint, so let me get it up on the screen to share. Okay, I believe the screen is up. Okay, we're going to be discussing redistricting in New York State in this session. But the first thing we have to understand is what reapportionment is. Reapportionment is basically the redistribution of districts in the U.S. House of Representatives among the 50 states based on population. What will happen next year is that the 2020 census population totals will be tallied by state, and then using a federal statute formula, the 50 states will be allocated their shares of congressional districts. It's called the method of equal proportions. It's been on the books since the 1940s. After every state gets at least one congressional district based on additional population, the remaining districts 51 through 435 are allocated to the states. That's a very quick process. By law, it should take place December 31st of this year. However, with the pandemic delaying census taking operations, which you're all probably familiar with, the Census Bureau has asked the Congress for permission to meet the reapportionment deadline by April 1st of next year. And following that, we get into redistricting. And redistricting is the process where district boundaries are redrawn within a state or within a city to reflect the population changes. Under federal law, that data should be delivered to New York State on or before April 1st of 2021. But again, with the pandemic, that's being delayed per congressional approval until July 30th of next year. Let me get to my next slide. So let's spend the rest of our hour on redistricting. And I use this cartoon as an example where you see someone looking at these strange shaped pieces and how do they all fit together to create a plan for New York State or for New York City. And I like to open up with this because it gives people the fulfillment to know, like, we don't really know what this is all about yet, so we hope we will find out. There are several basic rules that guide the redistricting process. The first is the US Constitution's requirement of one person, one vote, that one person's vote is equal to every other person's vote. And as a result of that, each state assembly, state senate, city council, and congressional district, county legislative districts, city councils must be equally populated for the body that's being redrawn. That's the first mandate. The second requirement is under the federal Constitution's 14th Amendment, equal protection, that all persons are treated fairly and equally in the redistricting process. The third factor is the Federal Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racial voting dilution to protect minority voters, where you have histories of racially polarized voting, or essentially where the minority voters are denied the opportunity to elect their preferred candidates of choice because of polarized voting and being outvoted by the white community, the white voters. And then finally, we have, for New York State purposes, New York State Constitution that was amended, as we've heard, in 2014 to create a new commission that will be meeting as soon as it finishes its picking its members very shortly. We heard from Assemblyman Rodriguez that there was a hearing yesterday undertaken by the legislature to consider changes to the calendar in light of the pandemic. And part of the focus there is to complete the composition of this commission. 8 members have been appointed so far, 2 by each of the legislative leaders, the Speaker, the Senate President Pro Tem, and the Senate and Assembly minority leaders. Those 8 members will meet soon and pick 2 additional members who must be unaffiliated with either political party. I know that Jennifer is going to get into some of the weeds on this in her presentation, but in a nutshell, the commission must undertake a robust outreach effort. It's got criteria that it needs to follow, which the legislature has not had to use before. The commission has several opportunities to develop plans to send to the legislature. A first set of Senate, Assembly, and congressional lines can be submitted to the legislature, which can reject that plan, send it back to the commission, and let the commission develop a second set of maps, which the legislature can accept or reject. And at that point, the legislature, on a third map go around, can develop any plan that it wants, hopefully working off an example set by the commission. And in all cases, final approval rests with the governor, who must approve the plan as he would for any state law. And that the new redistricting lines must be finalized and be put into effect for the 2022 elections. And part of what we're facing now is the issue that the 2014 amendments created a timeline for use in a fall primary situation. And as many of you know, the New York primaries are now held in the spring, in June. Excuse me, so that the calendar for line drawing needs to be speeded up. What should have been a 9-month process beginning in April 2021 and ending for the commission's purposes by the end of 2021 now has to be moved up in time so that both the commission and the legislature move forward with new plans that should probably be in place by sometime in February 2022. So that they could be implemented by county boards of elections and used for petitioning, primaries, and general elections in 2022. I'll end my remarks by just mentioning that New York's congressional delegation size and where these districts are drawn is all based on accurate census data. If people aren't counted in your community, then they're not going to be counted when the lines are drawn because the numbers won't be there. If there are 50,000 people in a community, but if the census only catches 45,000 or 40,000 of them, then the 5,000 or 10,000 people not counted won't be part of those district lines that are drawn. And that would be a real shame. In the 1820s, New York State had 27 members of Congress. By World War II, New York State had 45 members of Congress. But with population growth in the Southwest and the far West, and even in places like Florida, population has shifted and New York has lost congressional representation. We have 27 districts now, the same number as in 1820. We lost 5 districts after the 1980 census. So these numbers are real. And when New York has the seniority and the power in Congress to bring home the federal funds it needs, we need to have more members in place than fewer. We are projected based on census population trends to lose just 1 congressional district next year. But if we have a bad census count, if there's a considerable undercount, New York could lose 2 congressional districts. And that's not a pleasant process because when you lose districts, that means that members are merged together. They lose the districts that they used to represent, and that results in primaries and matchups and all sorts of situations. So we don't want to see that happen at all. I'm going to end my screen sharing and continue the conversation with Jennifer Wilson of the League of Women Voters, who will take us a bit more into the redistricting process as we'll be seeing it in Albany beginning this year through 2022. So Jennifer, please.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you, Mita and the entire New York Counts 2020 Coalition for putting this conference together. This is so timely. This is exactly what we need right now as we are starting to almost be halfway through the summer and the census is ongoing, and we think that redistricting now is the time to talk about it. So maybe that will help people to incentivize them to complete their census. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So my name is Jennifer Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director for the League of Women Voters of New York State, and our primary goal is always making sure that New Yorkers are educated on whatever is going on related to government. So whether it's voting and elections or some sort of government reform like redistricting, we want to make sure that the public knows exactly what's going on. I'm not a lawyer and I'm a very visual learner, so this PowerPoint is really for the layman kind of people who are kind of curious about redistricting. What does the process look like? What did we have before? Why do we have this new commission now? And what are some of the issues that we may face with our new commission? So here's just a quick overview of some of the things I'm going to be covering today. So looking back, we used to have a legislative task force on demographic research and reappropriament that worked with the legislature, the state legislature, to redraw state senate, state assembly, and congressional maps. So this was something that was established in 1978, and basically it allowed the legislature to draw their own maps and draw their own districts. So this is the website, just sort of the landing page for the website. It's up all year round, even when we're not doing redistricting, so you can find all of the maps on there. So if you're curious to kind of know what the districts are around you, this is a really great website to be able to see all of the maps from 2012. So here are some of the previous maps that have been drawn by our legislative commission. And back before we had our 2014 amendment to change these rules, it was very loose in terms of what sort of rules that the legislative task force had to follow. So it gave the staff a lot of flexibility in actually drawing these different lines. And NYPIRG actually had mentioned yesterday, and I remember this too, that back in 2012, they had, or 2011, when the amendment was kind of floating around, they had a contest of who could name the most craziest map. And I believe the one on the bottom left is the Abraham Lincoln riding a vacuum cleaner. And I definitely see it myself. So because there was sort of lax rules over how the districts had to be drawn, and because each house really had the opportunity to draw their own districts, there definitely was an issue with making sure that all communities were represented to the fullest extent possible. And one example that I always use is Hakeem Jeffries, who of course is now a congressman, at the time an assembly member, was actually redistricted out of his own assembly district. So he won the seat in 2000, and then 2 years later was gerrymandered out of his own home district because the legislature had the ability to redraw the lines without a lot of public input or oversight. So now we have our constitutional amendment, which was passed in 2014 and was ultimately voted on by the voters. The League was in support of this, and we say that the voters were obviously in support of this too, because it had to be an amendment voted on by the voters in order to be added to our Constitution that set out criteria for our map-making process. So we have a commission now, which Jeff kind of went over some of the specifics of the commission before, but I'll have a nice slide that you can take a picture of with your phone if you want to see it again later. But it's essentially a bipartisan commission so that either the majority or minority parties aren't negatively affected by having just the legislature being able to draw their own lines. We also have an increase in transparency through mandating 12 public hearings to happen throughout the state after the initial proposed maps are released so that people can have input. Whether they're out in Buffalo or down in Long Island, there is a hearing that they can attend to add input to this process. And it also established some firm deadlines so that the commission couldn't drag its feet and never put forward the maps and never allow for public input, which of course, as Jeff mentioned, is maybe not the best right now, because when we first had passed the amendment, we didn't have our state primary in June. And because the primary is in June now, and the maps are supposed to go to the legislature to be voted on in January of 2022, and our primary is in June of 2022, and petitioning starts around mid-February, if the first set of maps are thrown out, if they send them back and say redraft them, we're not really sure that that would be enough time to have the maps come back and be amended and be able to be voted on in order to take effect in 2022 for those state elections and congressional elections. So that's definitely something we're going to have to address this year. But here is that overview I mentioned of kind of what LAT4 used to look like versus what the commission looks like now. So like Jeff had mentioned earlier, 10 members, 4 of them, or 2 for each house from the majority and minority parties of each house in the Senate and the Assembly, and then the 2 additional members are actually nominated by the seated commission. So the 8 members get to pick the last 2, and those members cannot be affiliated with either of the major parties. And here is just another little overview again that kind of digs into the specifics about the commissioners. This was something that we were very concerned about, making sure that commissioners, even though they're from either the majority or minority party or not affiliated with either of those parties, that they didn't have any sort of tie to the legislature. So they weren't seated members, they hadn't been members of the legislature within the last 3 years, they weren't the spouse of a legislator, they weren't a lobbyist, they weren't a political party chair. There was lots of specific rules around actually nominating these commissioners to be on the commission. And something else that's really important that we'll dig into in a second, if you notice at the top here, I don't know if my head is in the way, but there was also a really big push to make sure that the members of the commission represented New York State voters and the population of New York State. So we didn't want all people of one race, all people of one gender. We wanted to make sure that we represented New York State's population on that commission so that no communities were left out of the conversation. So here is just a quick look at the commissioners that have been nominated so far. I took these brief backgrounds from Politico. I feel like they really undersell Elaine Frazier. She is fantastic. She is the I don't know if she's the sitting president or former president of the Albany Urban League, very active in Albany redistricting. But all of these commissioners have been nominated to the commission at this point. And as you can see from the appointed by column all the way to the left, you can see exactly which house and which party nominated these commissioners. And I also listed all the way on the right side the regions that they represent, because something else that was really important for commission members was making sure that they were representing the different areas of the state. So we didn't want to not have anybody from Buffalo and have all New York City people, or have all Capital Region people and not have Long Island people. So it's very important that this commission represents all the people of the state and all the areas of the state as well. So yesterday we had a hearing, as Assemblymember Rodriguez mentioned, to talk about some of maybe the critiques of the commission, maybe how the process could be improved going forward, since this is our first time with this independent redistricting commission. And something that I think Jorge is going to talk about later is the fact that there's currently only 1 woman who has been nominated to the commission, and there are no Latinx members who have been nominated to the commission. And I think Jorge is going to talk about that, so I won't dig in too deep there because he definitely has way more knowledge on it than I do. NALEO and LatinoJustice have been putting out a call to have more diversity, Latinx diversity on the commission, and we 100% support them. We also would like to see at least 1 other woman nominated to the commission. Women are, of course, more than 50% of New York State's population. There's no reason that a 10-member commission of New York State people only has 1 woman. There's also very vague procedural and operational rules for the commission. So we'd like to see either, maybe not necessarily recommendations from the legislature, but just see that the commission puts forward rules that are really making sure that there's lots of transparency, lots of accountability, and lots of room for public input in the process so that no one's being left out of the conversation. And of course, like we mentioned, the issue with the deadline, the petitioning deadline, is definitely something that's going to come up. Some groups have called for a constitutional amendment to fix this issue long term. We would like to see a statutory amendment at this point, and then maybe in the future a constitutional amendment, because this was something that was passed in 2014 and really hasn't been touched since then. We would really like to see the process just move forward as is without any constitutional amendments, and if anything does need to be addressed, address it through statute instead. And then lastly, something that the League worked on back in February before COVID hit was funding for the commission. So we really wanted to make sure that there was funds in place this year for the commission to start their work, since they were being seated this year. And there was $750,000 of funds appropriated through the Department of State, which we thought was a little unusual because in our view, the commission was sort of, they were separate from the legislature, independent, but sort of operating alongside the legislature. So we thought it made more sense to have the legislature have the money and give it to them, but instead it's through an executive agency, but the executive isn't really supposed to be involved in this process. And also, I'm not really sure the funding's enough exactly. This is a little summary of the 2020-2021 budget for the LAT4 Commission, which is working alongside of the Independent Redistricting Commission. And as you can see, they got significantly more funding than the commission did. And that may just be because the commission's just getting started and they aren't really established yet, but we definitely think that there should be at least equal funding between LAT4 and the Redistricting Commission if we want to see them really work. And here is just some of the cost factors that are going to be associated with the commission. So the constitutional amendment basically says that they are responsible for doing their own thing. They're responsible for hiring their own staff, for setting up these different meetings. Software is not included in there, but it's sort of assumed that if you're operating your own budget, then you will be doing all of this sort of funding, obviously through your staffing. So we definitely think that they could use maybe a little bit more money to get started and also a lot more support to get started. So here are some of our sort of recommendations for these fixes. So the main one being making sure that we have timely appointments of the last 2 commissioners and making sure that we do see that gender and racial diversity there to make sure that the commission is representing all New York State residents. And as I mentioned, early support of the commission, we had pointed to in our testimony yesterday that in California, their Secretary of State actually provides early support for their citizens-led redistricting commission. So they have, instead of appointing through the legislature, it's actually a citizen-led commission. And when they first form, they have staff support from the California Secretary of State to get them staff, to help them set up their staffing, to provide them meeting space and help them just get set up. Because of course, these commissioners, as great as they are in their own right, in their own locality, they don't necessarily know each other. So it would be very helpful if either an agency or the legislature could step in and just provide them some support, provide them meeting space, maybe provide them a Zoom account that they could use so that they could start getting set up and getting ready to do their work. And as I mentioned, having a statutory fix to the deadline would obviously be very ideal, and making sure that there's ample public input in this process is extremely important to us. These hearings, besides the hearings, we want to make sure that all of the meetings that the commission has are subject to open meetings law so that people can actually see their Zoom meetings when they have them, and make sure that the people know what's actually going on with this. And the last thing I want to mention is learning from our past failed commissions. We mentioned earlier, Assemblyman Rodriguez mentioned that there was the state funding for local groups to actually do this amazing census work. And this New York State Complete Count Commission was a commission that was formed back early in last year, but was formed too late. They never had their meetings in time. All of the commissioners had the absolute best of intentions, but because they had almost no staff support, they really didn't have any budget or anything, and they really didn't have anyone guiding them through the process. Their report came out so late. It really didn't have great guidance on how to spend the funding, and ultimately we've seen delay after delay after delay in that funding. And now here we are in the summertime, and those funds are still kind of in flux. And besides the Complete Count Commission, if you all might remember, the New York State Campaign Public Financing Commission was another commission that, although it was formed on time, had zero staff support, no budget, and they ultimately did propose a public campaign financing proposal, but not before they completely diverted from what they were made to do, to take on fusion voting, to take on small parties, and just completely go off the rails from what they were supposed to do. And personally, we didn't really love their final proposal on public financing as well. So we just really think that the sooner this commission gets formed, the better, the sooner we can provide support, the better, and the sooner we can allow for public input, the better. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jeff, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I think that was an excellent overview and presentation of both the commission's purpose, its structure, its timeline, and its challenge. And we will see where the appointments lead us, when the commission will meet, and what it will do, hopefully sooner than later. Our next speaker will be Jerry Vattamala, an attorney with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and a veteran redistrictor and litigator who has worked on creating and challenging redistricting plans in New York State, and I think across the country. And Jerry's going to talk to us a bit about what goes into making a map and how it relates to who people are and where they live and how districts ought to be created. Jerry, would you please put up your PowerPoint, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Jeff. My 8-year-old is in charge of my 3-year-old, so hopefully they don't come bursting into the room. We'll see. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about how communities can draw their own maps. I'm going to go over the process that we've done as AALDEF with the Asian American community in New York City. Let me just share my PowerPoint. And it was actually a submission that we presented to LAT4 in the last redistricting round. Get this up here. Okay. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that.
We do see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So you'll see the date here is September 7th, 2011 at one of the LAT4 hearings. And to give you a sense of timeline, we started in about April of 2011, meeting with community-based organizations. And, you know, if you are a community-based organization or you're active in the community, you want to get involved in redistricting, hopefully you'll get a sense of what's involved, at least the way that we do it. So we identified at the outset in New York City 15 different Asian American neighborhoods in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, where we do most of our work. And what we did was we met with the community-based organizations from those neighborhoods, and we sat down in a conference room and we had a projector, and we had the projection on the wall or on a slide, and it was a street map. And we asked them, okay, can you identify for us what your neighborhood boundaries are, right? And you'll see here, the first one I'm going to show you is, this is Flushing. So we sat down with community-based organizations in Flushing, and on the street map, you know, people had different ideas on the boundaries of their neighborhood. So some people said, oh, it's a railroad track. Some people said, no, it's this school, or it's this, you know, highway, or whatever it was, a playground. And this was sort of an iterative process where we tried to work to a consensus. And this, what you see here is the final consensus of the groups. And you see it's down to the street, the northern, southern, eastern, western boundaries. Once we had that consensus, we said, okay, this is our neighborhood boundary. And we used a legal term called a community of common interest, right? And this community of interest for Flushing is beyond, you know, just racial identity, right? That could be one of many factors. We asked them, you know, what makes Flushing Flushing, right? Why do you say that there's common interest or concern in Flushing? And we asked them a bunch of different questions about, okay, what's the housing like, right? Is it mostly rentals, apartments, condos, co-ops? Is it single family, multifamily? How about school district? Is there a common school district here? And elementary schools that feed into a junior high school, into a high school. Being New York City, we asked, what about transportation, common transportation lines, subway lines, bus lines, right? We asked about, you know, common employers. Some neighborhoods, there's, you know, a major employer that a lot of people work at, or common industries that a lot of community members are employed in. We also asked about any type of issues that the community had faced and organized around, whether it be zoning or labor issues or health issues. You know, is this an immigrant community? Is it mostly, you know, foreign born? Other cultural questions about common nation of origin, religious affiliation, you know, linguistic characteristics, right? Common language other than English that may be spoken here. Restaurants, and, you know, everything that goes into the character of the neighborhood. So we put that into a report that accompanied each district. And it basically was a narrative that described why the neighborhood is a community of common interest, right? And we submitted that in addition to the maps to LAT4. Another thing that we asked the community members, the community-based organizations, was, okay, usually the neighborhood, Flushing is a very large area, but as you'll see, I'll go through some of the other neighborhoods, the numbers are usually much lower. And it by itself usually cannot be its own legislative district, whether it be city council, assembly, state senate, or congressional. So we asked them, what are the surrounding neighborhoods that you think share some of those characteristics, and it would make sense to be included or joined together to form a legislative district, right? And then lastly, we ask, okay, what are the surrounding neighborhoods that are different, that it doesn't make sense, that you would not want to be grouped together with in a new district configuration? And this is something that I think all groups can do, is define their neighborhood boundaries, right? And at the basic level, what we're telling the map drawers, whether it's an independent commission or it's a legislature, that this is a community of common interest, and under any circumstance, regardless of what level we're at, this community of common interest should not be divided at any district configuration level, right? And it was a powerful submission. And again, I think, we didn't need to meet with the community groups to say this is where all the Asian people live, right? We have census data and ACS data, but that's more than this, and race was only one of many factors. So you see, this is Bayside. Here we have Elmhurst. I'm going to quickly go through these. Jackson Heights. And as I mentioned, you'll see that the numbers are much lower, and oftentimes did not amount to enough population to be a district of its own. And if you're wondering what the little red dotted lines are, those red dotted lines are the then existing state assembly lines. And we're going to go down to the bottom here. You see we did it for each borough, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, where there were multiple Asian American neighborhoods. Some of them were bigger, as Bensonhurst was over 200,000 people. The last one you'll see here is Manhattan's Chinatown and the Lower East Side, where there was a lot of cross collaboration with the Latino population. This is the last three slides. You'll notice here the blue lines, those are the Asian American neighborhoods. This one right here is Flushing, the first slide that I showed you. What we did was we superimposed those 15 Asian American neighborhoods over the then, at the time, existing state assembly lines. And this is where the light bulb sort of went off for a lot of our community members, and sort of where they realized the importance of redistricting. You'll notice that almost every single one of these Asian American neighborhoods is divided into multiple different assembly districts. This big one down here, this is the Indo-Caribbean community of Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park. 6 different assembly districts. All right, this neighborhood is divided up into 6 different assembly districts. This is a great way to disenfranchise, or at least dilute, the voting strength of community. I know many people on this call are involved, as we are at AALDEF, of doing naturalization work, getting folks, immigrants that come here, pulling them in, doing whatever we can to empower them. We work with them to naturalize, to become a U.S. citizen. Once they're naturalized, we're at the federal courthouse. Well, not right now, but usually every Friday after they take their oath to become a citizen, we register these new citizens to vote. A lot of you do get out the vote in the months and on election day. We do voter protection at the polls. All of that work that we're doing, the census work that we're doing, all of this really goes out the window and really undermines the work that we're doing if we don't have fair districts drawn. The beauty or the ugliness of redistricting is really exposed in this, because you can see, if you get all the people in your community to register to vote and come out to vote, if you're divided to 6 different districts, the community can never elect a candidate of its choice. That's why redistricting is so important. in my experience, redistricting is the most effective voter suppression tool out there. You don't need poll taxes and literacy tests and all those things if you have unfair redistricting, no matter what the community does. Even if they actually are able to cast a ballot, they're not going to be able to elect a candidate of their choice. And this, the light bulb did go off, I think, for a lot of community members. Other districts like Elmhurst, the neighborhood was divided to 5 different assembly districts. Again, in my humble opinion, this is not a coincidence. The community was completely disenfranchised, and it's not a surprise that despite having, at the time, over 1 million Asians in New York City alone, over 1 million, which would have been, if you look at the population alone, just the population of Asians in New York City would be the 10th largest city in the United States, right after Dallas, Texas. Okay, at the time when we did this redistricting in 2011, there had never been an Asian American elected to state Senate. There had never been an Asian American elected to Congress from New York State, despite having these enormous numbers. And this is why, a big reason why, at every level, city council, state assembly, state senate, congressional, there were very few Asian Americans elected to office, despite having large communities. For example, in Flushing, how were they not able to elect somebody? Well, redistricting was a big part of it. And when you finally had an Asian American first elected, let's say to city council, it's because the lines were drawn fairly. And for the first time, the community could elect a candidate of its choice. That's what happened at city council with John Liu. That's what happened at state assembly with Jimmy Meng. We had a district that was centered almost entirely in Flushing. And only after that happened was the community able to elect a candidate of its choice. Well, what about Congress? Well, one thing I want to mention, what I'm showing you here, these are Asian American communities of interest. You may be asking yourself, well, what about the other communities, the other communities that are protected by the Voting Rights Act? Well, yeah, that's the Black community, Latinx community. We need to know their communities of interest also. And that's why AALDEF worked with LatinoJustice and the Center for Law and Social Justice to compile and create the Unity Map. And that was a joint redistricting proposal that protected all the communities of color in New York City. And we did this for city council, state assembly, state senate, and for congressional lines in New York City. Some of you may recall Jeff mentioned earlier that we were involved in litigation. Our partners at LatinoJustice, as well as Center for Law for Social Justice, we all intervened in the federal lawsuit in the last round, Favors v. Cuomo. And you may recall the magistrate judge had empowered special master to redraw the congressional lines. Lat 4 didn't do it in the last round. Our submission to the special master were our communities of interest, those neighborhood maps, the accompanying narratives, the Unity Map proposals. We had proposed keeping in Eastern Queens here, centered in Flushing, a new congressional district that kept communities of interest whole. The judge agreed. He drew, the special master, I should say, agreed, drew almost a carbon copy of our proposed district in Queens. That was 40% Asian American. Well, guess what? Several months later, we had the first Asian American elected to Congress from New York State, Grace Meng. This is not a coincidence, folks. This is how you empower a community, and it lasts for 10 years. If we get it wrong and we have all these communities, these neighborhoods sliced and diced and having their voting strength diluted, we're never going to have people elected from those communities, or at least the candidate of choice from those communities. It's very unfair. So if we get redistricting right, what we've seen, the community only then is able to elect a candidate of its choice. And that's why it's so important. We talked about census earlier. The data that we use for redistricting, that's the census data. So if we don't have folks in these communities filling out the census data, the redistricting is not going to be fair either. So I think I'm close to my time, but I hope you all see the importance. I'm going to just quickly go down. You'll see state senate here. Look at some of these state senate lines. Look at Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, right down the middle. Flushing, right down the middle there. You know, this is really, really horrendous. What happened to some of these communities? Look at Bensonhurst here, all the different Senate districts there. It is almost impossible, as I mentioned, to elect a candidate of your choice if you have redistricting that looks like this. And if you get it right, you have the community finally empowered and an equal footing with other communities to elect a candidate of its choice. So this is the process that we did. We're planning to do it again. We did this in multiple states around the country. New York City is pretty unique because you have all these different racial groups and there is racially polarized voting. But we're hoping to work with our colleagues with the Unity Map. And you know, anyone else that's interested, I'm happy to speak with folks offline if they want to do the same thing for their communities. That's the same sort of refrain you hear at all of these redistricting hearings, the public ones. Everybody that comes out says the same thing: don't divide our communities. And we can do this in a fair way where everyone gets an equal chance to elect candidates of their choice. We don't have to, you know, let the status quo stand and have communities be divided like what you see in front of you right here. That's just completely unfair, and we can't allow that to happen in this next round. So with that, I think I'll end there.
Hey, Jerry, thank you very much. That was a really powerful presentation and shows the importance of both the census data and having communities work together to know who the residents are, where they live, and how they can be best represented in Washington, Albany, and City Hall. And building on that presentation, we'll now turn to Jorge Vasquez from LatinoJustice to show us some more of how community empowerment is important and the line drawing process. So Jorge.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. And I'd like to first thank Jennifer for mentioning the lack of diversity on New York's Independent Redistricting Commission. As Jennifer alluded to, and as my colleague Jose Perez testified yesterday before the Assembly and the Senate, to date, there hasn't been one person of Latinx origin that's been appointed to New York's Independent Redistricting Commission. In order to understand the importance of numbers, I like to start with how New York is divided, how divided by population, how many people live there, and then divided by ethnicity. So it's estimated that New York has around 8.4 million people that call New York home, or New York City home. Out of that population, about 1/4 are Latinx, about, almost 1 million are of Asian descent, and around 2 million are Black. So when we're looking at these total numbers and we look at the state population, what we're seeing is that a significant portion of the state are Latinx, Black, and Asian community. And as Jerry was mentioning earlier and kind of ended on, is this idea of building communities of interest. And when we build communities of interest, what we're doing is we're reaching out directly to people in the community. And we're saying to the people in the community, having the experience of working with them, having the experience of litigating on behalf of them, and understanding that while every constitutional right is important, while all civil rights are important, without voting, you're essentially diluting all the other constitutional rights that our people have. So what we do at LatinoJustice and have been doing for over the last 5 decades is we empower the Latinx community and protect their civil rights. And one of those ways is through voting. Both educating voters on what their rights are, both doing election protection, as AALDEF does and many other groups here does, but also with regards to redistricting. It's imperative that when we look at New York and we look at elected officials throughout New York State, that the elected officials represent the interests of the communities. And it's impossible for an elected official to represent the interests of their community if their community and the majority of those communities and communities of interest aren't empowered with deciding who's going to be their elected official. It's also important that the elected officials look like those people who they represent, but at the same time, it's equally important to note that it's more than possible for communities of interest or majority communities that are Latinx, Black, or Asian to decide that the best person to represent them is someone who's not representative of their ethnicity or culture. Keeping in mind that no one race is monolithic. The Latinx community is very diverse, just as I imagine other communities are. So that's why it's imperative that we look to communities of interest, because within the Latinx community, you might have someone who identifies differently than someone else who is also Latinx or would be categorized as Latinx. So what we've done in New York City is we've created a unity mapping coalition, and that coalition consists of LatinoJustice, AALDEF, and the Center for Law and Justice out of Medgar Evers College. And what we've been doing for the last few decades is working together to see where is it that our people are moving to, where is it that we're seeing trends of different, different things related to those that we serve. So that way we could work together as it relates to redistricting and ensure that all communities are empowered. It's also important to note that because we're in this civil rights world, sometimes our communities don't see eye to eye on civil rights issues. Some might feel that, let's look at, for example, high schools, standardized, specialized high schools in New York City. Traditionally, Black and Latinx individuals are not accepted into the Stuyvesants, Bronx Sciences, and Brooklyn Techs of New York City. On the other hand, the Asian American community traditionally does very well. And sometimes when communities like ours, the Latinx community and the Black community, is saying we need to integrate these schools, it's possible for the Asian community to believe that Latinx and Black communities saying this goes against their interests, since their students, their children are being accepted to these schools. And I'm giving this background because these are the kind of conversations that happen when we
Jerry,
are meeting with coalitions, where we're meeting with community-based organizations saying, listen, we're interests here, and this is how we create political power. It's important to understand that, sometimes we disagree on other issues, but being able to work with AALDEF, being able to collaborate with the Center for Law and Justice, and knowing that the Center for Law and Justice is very active within the Black community, knowing that AALDEF is very active in the Asian community, knowing that LatinoJustice is very active in the Latinx community, provides the amount of confidence in our communities to trust us and to know that we have their best interests. And as Jorge has said, if we just look at the last round of redistricting, what we've been able to do as a community is ensure that congressional districts and local districts represent the interests of their communities. When we look at Congressman Espaillat and knowing that LatinoJustice assisted in drawing this district, and as Jerry, and as you might remember, Jeff, Congressman Espaillat, prior to becoming a congressman, was vocal against LatinoJustice's maps, right? And said, we don't want LatinoJustice drawing this map. They don't know what they're talking about. Fast forward, he's an ally of us, and we accept any criticism, and we want to work with every community. But it shows that there's power in working together. There's powers in the numbers. And to bring back around how we started when we talked about the decennial census, Jerry, I think you remember, almost 2.5 years ago, back in March of 2018, we stood at NYC to address the importance of our communities being counted, because we understand how the decennial census impacts the reapportionment and the next steps. And looking nationally and seeing that the rise of Latino political power, which nationally is over 32 million, looking at the rise of the fastest growing racial minority group, Asians in America, that within the next round of census, it's possible that, the Asian political power is going to be at a new peak. And working with groups like the League of Women Voters, working with NYC to ensure that we're empowering communities to understand what's at stake. And what's at stake is true political power. It's talking about ensuring that our communities have the resources that they need, from language access to healthcare facilities to schools. And that's very hard to do if our communities aren't empowered with being able to decide who represents them. Because who represents the community in large part determines how the day-to-day of our communities operate, whether that's overcrowded schools, whether that's building a new school, whether that's a hospital being closed, whether or not our communities are able to get something as simple as language translation and language access. When we look at New York State and we look from Suffolk County to Erie County, we're seeing that there are growing populations of the Asian community, the Black community, the Latinx community. And what we're starting to see both in Washington, D.C., as well as in the state assembly, the state senate, we have 2 new Asian state senators for the first time, right? We have Kevin Thomas, we have Senator Liu also, is that the work that we're doing is showing that the results and the justice that needs to happen within the redistricting process has to be centered with communities of interest communicating. It's impossible for there to be this political power of any ethnic minority group without groups coming together. So people watching online at home, if you have any questions around the redistricting process, first, please fill out the census. Go online and complete the census if you haven't. And if you did, then reach out to someone who hasn't and help them fill out the census. And then second, I think it's important to get involved with organizations like LatinoJustice. You could go to LatinoJustice.org, sign up for our emails. You can follow us online. The same is true for the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. Be involved in complete count coalitions like New York Counts 2020. Be active within your community, and you're the best eyes and ears to how the community is changing. You live there, you understand it, you know whether there are different languages being spoken in community or not. And in order for us to ensure that there's a fair representation is gonna take a concentrated effort on behalf of all of us. So I would like to end with just stating how Jerry ended it, that unity mapping is a process which includes the entire community and is meant to ensure that communities of interest are best suited to have the power to elect a candidate of their choice. A candidate of their choice does not necessarily mean someone who is the same ethnicity as them, doesn't even mean the person speaks the same language as them, but someone who has their values. And as we enter this round of redistricting, I look forward to working with AALDEF, to working with the Center for Law and Justice, but also to working with everyone here. LatinoJustice sent the letter to the state majority and minority leaders back on March 12th, asking for Latinx representation on the Independent Redistricting Commission. And I'll end with saying that it's imperative that if 1 out of 5 New Yorkers are Latinx, which they are, then it's imperative that we have Latinx representation on this Independent Redistricting Commission. And I thank you, Jeff, and everyone involved in putting this together and for including LatinoJustice. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. We have about 15 minutes left for questions, answers, and wrap up. We had a few questions in the question box, and what I'd like to do is just address each one of them quickly, ask any of my colleague panelists if they'd like to add a few seconds comment to it, and then we'll have Mita close out the session by 12:30. The first question that was posted asked about how the city is spending its census money, and I would direct anyone who's interested in what New York City is doing to go Google the New York City Census Office project, and you'll see a ton of information there and how you can get involved through the New York City effort. Any other comments on New York City? Okay. The second question was, in what year does the Federal Voting Rights Act expire? Well, the Voting Rights Act that applies for redistricting is called Section 2, and it prevents minority vote dilution. I alluded to it earlier in my own remarks. That is now a permanent part of federal statute. It doesn't expire. However, I'll point out that a previous section, a different section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, requires that no new redistricting plan or election law can go into effect if it diminishes or weakens the position of minority voters. New York's Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Bronx counties fell under Section 5 requirements that required the Federal Justice Department or special federal court to pre-approve or pre-clear, as we call it, any change to the district lines to make sure that minority voting wasn't diluted or diminished. Unfortunately, in 2013, the US Supreme Court invalidated the coverage formula in what was called Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which basically gutted the applicability of Section 5. So for the first time in 30 years, the New York Congressional, State Senate, City Council, Assembly lines will not need pre-clearance by the Justice Department or a DC court, which puts the burden on the redistrictors to make sure that minority voting strength is properly protected. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I would say for people in New York has pending legislation, the New York Voting Rights Act, which restores the pre-clearance requirements and expands upon it. And I encourage everyone to reach out to their local elected officials and ensure that New York State passes the New York Voting Rights Act.
You're breaking up on us a little bit there. Okay.
Sorry.
Hey, Jerry?
I just want to say, in terms of timeline, I don't know if Jeff, if you mentioned this, it was in 2006, it was authorized, at least Section 5 was for another 25 years. And actually Section 203, which requires translations and other language assistance in certain jurisdictions, that was also extended for another 25 years. And I think that the vote was 98-0 in the Senate,
right,
and almost was overwhelming in the House.
Yeah, but for redistricting purposes, the big section is Section 2. That's used throughout the country. It's been used in New York State, most recently in Rockland County. A school board was thrown out for violating minority voting rights using Section 2, and there's a case still pending in Islip on Long Island for the failure to enable the Latino community to have its proper voting strength. Jennifer, do you have any comments on these questions? Okay. The next question was what kind of public outreach, how will the community be informed of what's going on and the need to be involved with redistricting? I can assure you that all of us are going to be involved. Really, once the census is taken, that will go through October, there'll be robust efforts everywhere on redistricting outreach and education and involvement. I think you'll see from the three organizations on the presentations today, they will all be very active. And please contact us if you'd like to have an educational outreach effort in your community or before your organization. The last question that was posted asks whether it's possible for the timeline of reapportionment and redistricting to be shifted due to the pandemic. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the Census Bureau has asked Congress to change the statutory deadlines for both reapportionment and redistricting data. For reapportionment to the Congress from December 31st of this year to April 1st of next year, and subsequently to delay the delivery of the census data for the states to use to redistrict from April 1st to July 30th of next year. In light of those changes, yesterday the legislature held a hearing to receive public input from experts and organizations on how the state can shift the constitutional and statutory deadlines to meet the, the pandemic realities of Census Bureau data. And the legislature might take up something as soon as next week when it's in session in Albany. We'll find out shortly. Any additional comments on that from anyone? Okay, I don't see any other questions in the queue. We have about 5-10 minutes left. So if you do have any questions, I urge you to post them now. And in the meantime, I will pass the microphone back to Mita Anand for final comments. But again, if you have a question, please post it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, my list of thank yous extends for a while, so that gives people a chance to think about what questions they may have. And before I thank our panelists and Jeff, who deserved thanks, I think it's always important to remember that events like this take the work of lots of people. So I particularly want to thank Carlos Rosales from the Citizens Committee of Children, who's been invaluable in helping us put this event together all week long. Aaron Flores, who is from Bibliosol. Those of you that go to the New York Counts 2020 website, which, subtle plug there, that website is as fabulous as it is because of Aaron Flores. And Natalie Bernstein, who also helps make everything fabulous and runs our social media for Census from New York Immigration Coalition. We have Jim Bay from Queens Public Library and Hillary Medina Lovelace from Census Counts, that's the national campaign arm, the campaign arm of the Leadership Conference. So, really great group of people that helped make this come together. And I really want to make sure we give them the praise that is due, because it's easy to see who's talking here and all you do great work, but there's work that happens on the back end too. And speaking of the people here, Jeff, thank you so much for your remarks and for your work on Census, but also on redistricting. I know you're going to be helping a lot of people figure this out going forward. Jennifer, thank you. Always a pleasure to work with you. Jerry, it's been a while. Good to see you. I think we saw each other in person, like right before this all just went, stay at home. And Jorge, always a real pleasure. So thank you. And Assembly Member, if you're still listening, thank you so very much for your leadership in this area and in Census, and for your remarks, both on Census and redistricting. I do want to make a plug for our final event tomorrow. It's going to be a great day. We have a kickoff by Jeff Baylor from the Census Bureau. And then we are going to have breakout sessions on different types of outreach. So really, now that we've learned the importance of the redistricting work and that the census work feeds into that, we should all now be motivated to make sure that we get that count up as much as possible, and ideally before August 11th, when the census takers come. We can do it after that, but we want to see a huge push before then. So we're going to have a bunch of outreach workshops, and then Vanita Gupta from the Leadership Conference is delivering our closing remarks. So she's a personal hero of mine. I'm thrilled that we're going to be seeing her. So that's what I have to say by way of thank you and by way of plugging tomorrow. And I haven't seen anything come through, Jeff, have you?
No, I haven't, but I'll just add that we still have several dozen people on the call that if you have not filled out the census yet, or your family and friends and relatives haven't filled out the census yet, join the club every day, talk to somebody to fill out the census. You'd be amazed how there are census tracts throughout New York State that if 4 or 5 households per day in each tract completed the census, we'd be at the same level the state was at 10 years ago. We're not there yet. So every household counts. Please do all you can to count people. I can't say it any stronger.
Thank you, Jeff. I think Jorge once gave a wonderful mathematical example of how you could just, fundraise, think of it as fundraising and get to $1 million just by making sure 4 other households are counted. And you get to 100,000 and multiply that by 10 for the 10 years and you're at $1 million and bam, you're a fundraiser. So
if you haven't called that third cousin, you've been meaning to call for months or years, call them and say, have you filled out the census yet? It's a good icebreaker. Creative. Think outside the envelope. Take ownership of the census. I try to come up with pithy terms all the time that resonate with messaging, but please, make this census count. There are no second chances. With that, I will stay on the line for, about 3-4 more minutes. If anyone has a question they'd like to still post. Otherwise, I want to thank you all very much. Mita for taking the initiative to create this great week of conferences via Zoom, and Natalie and Carlos and Aaron and all the others who have made this a success. So we'll end the program here. And again, I'll stay online for a few minutes. And of course, thank you to Jerry and Jorge and Jennifer and Assemblyman Rodriguez.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good one, all.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Well,
thank you, Jeff. I'll see you later. I'm going to end it. Yep. All right. Thank you so much.
Zoom at 12:30. Bye, everybody.
Bye.